I'm Stephanie Hankins. I'm the campus minister at Appalachian State University, and I want to say thank you for the support that we have received from this church, both financially and as board members, and also having Leela here as an employee. We appreciate that. And I also want to say thank you to Charlie and Leela for giving up their Sunday morning sleeping time to come to church with me. I'm grateful for that. Our Old Testament reading comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 16, verses 2 through 15. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I am going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. And that way I will test them whether they will follow my instructions or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on other days." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evenings you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your complaining against the Lord. For what are we that you complain against us?" And Moses said, "When the Lord gives you meat in the evening and your fill of bread in the morning, because the Lord has heard your complaining that you utter against him, what are we? Your complaining is not against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole congregation of the Israelites, 'Draw near to the Lord, for he has heard your complaining.'" And as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the Israelites, they looked toward the wilderness, and the glory of the Lord appeared in a cloud. The Lord spoke to Moses and said, "I have heard the complaining of the Israelites. Say to them, 'At twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God.'" In the evening quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine, flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat." This is the word of the Lord. This summer, my husband and I took our two boys, who are 5 and 2, on a trip to the beach. As with any car trip, we had only been in the car about 20 minutes when Miller and Nathaniel started asking us, "Are we getting close to the beach yet?" "No," we answered. "See the mountains outside of the windows? That means we're still pretty close to Boone." Things quieted down for about 5 minutes, and then from the back seat we heard, "How much longer now?" And "I'm hungry. Can we stop for a snack?" And "When is lunch?" And "How much longer till we get to the beach?" And so it went for the next 4 hours in the car. In the scripture reading from Exodus, we hear the Israelites complaining to Moses and Aaron as they begin their trip into the wilderness. In fact, we're only 2 verses into the wilderness story, and already the Israelites are resisting the wilderness and wanting to return to Egypt. Remember, this group just fled their homes in Egypt. Just weeks earlier, they had been slaves, working in the fields, collecting grain for Pharaoh, and laboring as brickmakers, making bricks that were used to build the silos that stored Pharaoh's massive accumulation of grain. Pharaoh owned all the land. He maintained absolute control over the lives of his people. So Egypt had not been much of a home for the Israelite slaves. But then along came the burning bush and Moses, and God's call for Moses to confront Pharaoh and demand that Pharaoh let God's people go. Yet Pharaoh refused time and time again. And the Lord demonstrated his mastery over Pharaoh and over Egypt through disastrous plagues. Finally, Pharaoh allowed the Israelites to go free, but then changed his mind and made the unfortunate decision to follow them with his army into the Red Sea. The Egyptian army, with all their chariots and their wealth and their horses, met a watery death as the tattered and poor and tired group of former slaves escaped into the wilderness, into their new home. A few weeks later, and already this group of people wandering in the wilderness has begun complaining. If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. This wilderness seems to intent to shock us when it puts these words into the mouths of former slaves who received nothing for their labor in Egypt and who worked the fields for Pharaoh, who treated them like animals. A master who took the gifts of the earth and kept them for his own profit. But as they entered the wilderness, Israel did not remember the hard labor that was required of them in Egypt. They remember only their capacity to eat their fill there. They are hungry, and they remember Pharaoh as the one who provided their bread. So they begin to complain to Moses and Aaron, and the Lord hears them and says to Moses, I am going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. Moses and Aaron tell the Israelites what God has said, and they add that in the morning they will see the glory of the Lord because he has heard their complaining. And as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation, they looked toward the wilderness, and the glory of the Lord appeared in a cloud. Now they are beginning to see that this wilderness might not be what they expect. Perhaps now they are beginning to see that it is occupied and governed by the God who overpowered the glory of Pharaoh. And unlike Pharaoh, God hears the people complain, and God tells Moses to tell the people that at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will have your fill of bread. And then you shall know that I am the Lord your God. Of course, this is just what God told Pharaoh, then you shall know that I am the Lord your God, when God warned him about the plagues. Now God has transformed from the inflictor of plagues into the generous provider of bread from heaven. And true to his promise, in the evening the quails come up and cover the camp, and in the morning the ground was covered with a fine, flaky substance. And they wondered about it, and they wondered what it was. And as Walter Brueggemann calls it, they said, Wonder bread was sent by God. This heavenly wonder bread is different from the bread of Pharaoh. Pharaoh's bread was all about surplus and storage, whereas the bread of heaven is about faithfulness and trust. And in that moment, they see that the Creator God has the capacity to transform the wilderness into creation, to transpose this place of hunger into a venue of abundance. Here we have to note that it is the presence of God's glory in the wilderness that transforms the circumstances of Israel. And what about the wilderness that we stand and face today? If you listen to the news, it often feels like we're wandering in a very scary wilderness of our own. We hear about ISIS in Syria and Iraq, the outbreak of Ebola in so many countries in Africa, more and more cases of domestic violence in the NFL, and closer to home, the news of the search for and unexpected death of the ASU student Anna Smith. In my own family, my sister-in-law finds herself wandering in a new wilderness, as only 2 weeks ago she was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she has already started her 18 rounds of chemo. And my best friend Jeannie finds herself wandering in the wilderness after the death of her father on Friday, only 6 months after the death of her sister. Like the Israelites, we too find ourselves having to turn and face the wilderness. And like the Israelites, we often find that the wilderness is not what we expect. And as we travel, we may wonder, where is God in the midst of this mess? And how are we going to survive? I have come to trust that in our own wilderness, it is occupied and governed by the same God who overpowered Pharaoh, the same God who sent wonder bread to cover the ground and filled the Israelites' empty stomachs. It is this presence of God's glory in the wilderness that transformed the circumstances of Israel. And it is the presence of God that transforms our own circumstances as well. God is here with us in this wilderness and provides us with our own miraculous wonder bread. True, we are not opening our tents every morning to find the ground covered with a fine flaky substance, and we may not see the glory of the Lord appearing in a cloud, but we do glimpse God's presence and work in our world. Just this week, my sister-in-law expressed her gratitude and wonder when her hairdresser didn't charge her to cut her hair short, and then left a basket of scarves on her doorstep to cover her head, which will soon have no hair. My friend Jeff, who is helping care for his aging grandmother who has Alzheimer's, saw God when they found the perfect caregiver to sit with Nanny a few hours each day. And my friend Jeannie said that she has felt God through the well-timed phone calls of friends, the prayers of loved ones, and the visits from their priest who administered her father's last rites. A thoughtful friend, the perfect caregiver, a basket of scarves, or a basket of loaves and fishes, or a basket of wonder bread. God is present and powerful in this wilderness. Our lives are sometimes a rich source for doomsday thinking and feeling. It's enough to make us want to call out to the front seat of the car and ask, can we go back? Rather than continuing on our journey into the wilderness. But it is possible for us to resist this temptation and to stand with our feet planted firmly in the wilderness, never losing our spiritual ground. And if we look, I am sure we will catch a glimpse of the Lord our God, who provided the Israelites with heavenly wonder bread for their journey, and who continues to provide for us as well. Despair is what we are left with in Egypt. But when we follow God into the wilderness, we are left with wonder, the wonder of the bread of life, and the nourishing cup of salvation. And we are grateful. Thanks be to God.